The silence over the radio lasted exactly 17 seconds. In the world of tactical communications, 17 seconds might as well be an eternity. Staff Sergeant Marcus, Bulldog, Rodriguez pressed his headset tighter against his ear, hopping to catch even the faintest whisper of static that might indicate the SEAL team was still breathing somewhere in those God-forsaken mountains of eastern Afghanistan. Nothing. Just the hollow emptiness that every forward air controller dreaded, the sound of good men gone dark. 3 hours earlier, Neptune 6 had checked in with their usual cocky confidence. 8 of America's finest special operators, inserted under cover of darkness into a valley that intelligence swore was lightly defended. Their mission: eliminate a high-value target who'd been orchestrating IED attacks across the province. Simple in, simple out. Except nothing about Afghanistan was ever simple. Rodriguez shifted his weight against the sandbagged wall of Combat Outpost Viper, his weathered hands automatically checking his equipment for the 100th time. The SINCGARS radio, the laser target designator, the worn notebook where he'd scribbled the SEAL team's last known coordinates. Grid 41, RQR 23,456 78,901. Numbers that had become burned into his memory like a brand. The first sign of trouble came at 3:47 hours, when Neptune 6's routine check-in never arrived. By 400, when their backup communication window also passed in silence, Rodriguez felt that familiar knot forming in his stomach. He'd been calling in close air support for over a decade, through Iraq's bloody urban warfare and Afghanistan's unforgiving mountain campaigns. He knew the difference between radio discipline and radio silence. This was the latter. Colonel James Ironside Mitchell paced behind the Tactical Operations Center like a caged predator, his steel-gray eyes fixed on the digital displays showing friendly force positions. 8 green dots had simply vanished from the screen, swallowed by the electronic void that marked dead zones in the Afghan mountains. Intelligence suggested the Taliban had been monitoring coalition communications, learning their patterns, setting traps. Neptune 6 might have walked straight into one. The rescue attempts had already begun and failed spectacularly. 2 Apache gunships, pride of the aviation fleet, had thundered into the valley only to be driven back by concentrated small arms fire and the ever-present threat of shoulder-fired missiles. A quick reaction force of Rangers, loaded into Black Hawks, had barely made it past the ridgeline before taking fire so intense that their pilots were forced to abort. Even a B-1B bomber, circling at 30,000 feet, couldn't get a clear shot at the enemy positions without risking the lives of any surviving SEALs below. That's when someone mentioned Viper. The word carried through the Tactical Operations Center like electricity through copper wire. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Officers looked up from their maps and computer terminals. Even the usually unflappable Colonel Mitchell paused in his packing. Captain Zara, Viper, Blackwood wasn't supposed to be available. Her A-10C Thunderbolt II was officially down for maintenance, and she was scheduled for mandatory crew rest after pulling a 36-hour combat air patrol rotation. But when word reached her that 8 SEALs were missing in action, Blackwood did what she always did. She ignored the regulations and started pre-flight on her aircraft anyway. The maintainers working on her Thunderbolt looked up in surprise as she approached the hardstand, her flight suit already zipped and her helmet bag slung over her shoulder. Technical Sergeant Maria Santos, her dedicated crew chief, didn't even bother to ask why Blackwood was there. She simply began removing the safety pins from the GAU-8 Avenger cannon and downloading the aircraft's systems. "Ma'am, we haven't finished the hydraulic pressure checks," Santos called out, but her voice carried approval rather than concern. She'd worked on Viper's aircraft for 2 years and had learned to trust the pilot's judgment completely. "How long?" Blackwood asked, already conducting her walk-around inspection with practiced efficiency. 10 minutes if I skip the paperwork." "Skip the paperwork." This was how legends began in the United States Air Force. not with grand proclamations or ceremonial fanfare, but with quiet professionalism in the pre-dawn darkness of a combat airfield. While other pilots slept or flew routine missions, Captain Zara Blackwood was about to write her name in the annals of close air support history. The radio crackled to life as Blackwood's A-10 taxied toward the runway. Bagram Tower, this is Viper 11 requesting immediate departure, priority Alpha. Viper 11 Bagram Tower, you're not on the flight schedule. Bagram Tower, Viper 11, 8 Americans are missing in the mountains. I'm going to find them. There was a pause before the tower responded, but when they did, their voice carried the weight of understanding. Viper 11, you are cleared for immediate departure. Godspeed. The Pratt & Whitney TF-34 engines spun up to full power, their distinctive whine echoing across the airfield as 30,000 pounds of American-built close air support aircraft accelerated down the runway. At 5:23 hours, Captain Zara Blackwood lifted off into the Afghan dawn, alone except for her aircraft and her unwavering determination to bring those SEALs home. What happened next would be debated in military academies for decades to come, analyzed in tactical journals, and whispered about in pilot-ready rooms around the world. But for Rodriguez, watching that distinctive silhouette climb into the morning sky, there was only hope, the first he'd felt since Neptune 6 went dark. The mountains of eastern Afghanistan were about to witness something extraordinary. In the Tactical Operations Center at Bagram Airfield, officers gathered around communication consoles, their coffee growing cold as they listened to the radio chatter. Colonel Mitchell stood at the center of it all, his arms crossed over his chest, watching the single green dot that represented Viper 11 as it moved steadily toward the last known position of Neptune 6. "Sir," Rodriguez's voice came through the speakers, "Viper 11 is approaching the target area." Mitchell keyed his microphone. "Viper 11 Chaos Main. Be advised, we've lost 2 Apache and a QRF attempting rescue in that valley. Recommend extreme caution." Blackwood's response was calm, professional, and tinged with the confidence that only came from hundreds of combat hours. "Chaos Main, Viper 11. Copy all. I'm not here to play it safe." The A-10C Thunderbolt II was never designed to be beautiful. With its ungainly profile, massive cannon, and armor plating that made it look more like a flying tank than an aircraft, beauty was never the point. The point was survival, both for the pilot and the ground forces she protected. As Blackwood banked her aircraft over the ridgeline that separated the relative safety of coalition airspace from the Taliban-controlled valley below, she felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. Below, hidden somewhere in the maze of rocky outcroppings and narrow ravines, 8 of America's finest warriors were either fighting for their lives or already beyond help. Intelligence suggested they'd been ambushed shortly after sunrise, caught in a carefully planned kill zone that had been months in the making. The Taliban had learned to be patient, to study American tactics, and to strike when their enemies were most vulnerable. But they hadn't counted on Viper. Blackwood's call sign wasn't chosen randomly, nor was it assigned by some computer system that matched pilots to aircraft. She'd earned it the hard way during her first deployment to Iraq, when she'd spent 6 hours circling a besieged patrol base, making gun runs so close to friendly forces that she could see the faces of the Marines she was protecting. When other pilots would have declared too close for comfort and pulled back, Blackwood pressed her attacks closer, her cannon fire landing within meters of coalition positions. The Marines started calling her Viper after that first deployment, not because she was venomous, but because she struck fast, struck hard, and never missed her target. The name stuck, eventually making its way into official records and onto the nose art of her aircraft. Now, 5 deployments and over 800 combat hours later, that call sign carried weight throughout the Air Force community. Viper 11 Chaos Main, what's your tactical picture? Blackwood's eyes swept across her instruments and the terrain below. The situational awareness data link was painting targets across her multifunction displays, but electronic signatures were unreliable in these mountains. She would have to rely on Mark 1 eyeball and years of experience to locate both the enemy and any surviving SEALs. Chaos Main, I'm seeing significant activity in the valley floor. Multiple heat signatures, probable defensive positions along the eastern ridge. No sign of friendly forces yet. What she didn't report was the knot in her stomach that had been growing since takeoff. 8 SEALs, the most elite warriors in the American military, didn't simply disappear without a trace. They didn't go dark on communications unless something catastrophic had happened. And catastrophic in Afghanistan usually meant casualties. The Taliban had been perfecting their ambush tactics for over a decade, learning from each engagement, adapting to American technology and procedures. They knew that special operations forces relied on speed and surprise, so they developed ways to slow them down, pin them in killing zones, and methodically eliminate them with overwhelming firepower. As Blackwood descended toward the valley floor, her threat warning systems began chirping. Surface-to-air missiles, possibly shoulder-fired, were attempting to lock onto her aircraft. She dispensed chaff and flares automatically, the aluminum strips and burning magnesium creating a metallic constellation in the morning sky. "Taking fire," she reported calmly, banking hard left to avoid a missile trail that streaked past her cockpit. "Sam's in the valley, continuing approach." This was where the A-10's design philosophy truly shined. While fast jets would have climbed for altitude and safety, the Thunderbolt II was built to absorb punishment and keep fighting. Redundant flight controls, self-sealing fuel tanks, and titanium armor around the cockpit meant that Blackwood could press her attack even under fire. But armor and redundancy meant nothing if she couldn't find Neptune 6. The valley stretched out below her like a moonscape, all harsh angles and deep shadows where American warriors might be hiding or dying. Every rock formation could conceal an ambush position. Every dried riverbed might hold the bodies of men who trusted her to bring them home. Blackwood keyed her radio and switched to the emergency frequency that all special operations forces monitored. "Neptune 6, Neptune 6, this is Viper 11 on guard. If you can hear this transmission, key your radio twice." Silence. She tried again, broadcasting on every frequency she knew the SEALs might be monitoring. Any Neptune element, this is close air support on station. I'm here to get you home. Still nothing. That's when she saw the smoke. A thin wisp of black smoke rising from a position approximately 2 kilometers southeast of Neptune 6's last known coordinates. Not the thick, billowing smoke of an explosion, but the controlled burn of a signal fire. The kind special operations forces used when all other communication methods had failed. "Chaos Main, Viper 11. I have possible friendly signal smoke bearing 140 degrees from Neptune's last known. Investigating." "Negative, Viper 11. That area is too hot. We've lost 2 aircraft already." Blackwood's response was immediate and left no room for argument. "Chaos Main, I didn't fly out here to orbit at 20,000 feet. If those are my guys down there, I'm going to get them." She pushed the stick forward, diving toward the valley floor at a speed that would have been reckless in any other aircraft. But the A-10 was built for this kind of punishment, designed to operate in the weeds where other aircraft feared to go. As her altitude decreased, details on the ground became clearer, and what she saw made her blood run cold. The Taliban hadn't just ambushed Neptune 6, they'd surrounded them. Dozens of muzzle flashes twinkled from positions all around the smoke signal, a deadly constellation of automatic weapons fire converging on a single point where 8 Americans were making their last stand. The enemy had positioned themselves with tactical precision, using the terrain to mask their approach and concentrate their firepower. But they'd made one critical error. They'd never faced Viper. Chaos Main, I have visual on Neptune 6. They're surrounded and taking heavy fire. I'm going in. Viper 1-1 negative. Wait for backup. Blackwood's response was lost in the roar of her engines as she dove toward the Taliban positions. At 400 feet above ground level, traveling at 300 knots, she was well within the envelope of every small arms weapon on the battlefield. Tracer rounds streaked past her cockpit like angry hornets, some so close she could see their red cores burning in the morning light. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon spun up with its characteristic whine, a sound that every infantryman in Afghanistan knew meant salvation was about to rain from the sky. 30mm depleted uranium rounds began chewing through Taliban positions at a rate of nearly 4,000 rounds per minute, each projectile carrying enough kinetic energy to punch through concrete bunkers and armored vehicles. The effect was immediate and devastating. Enemy fire that had been concentrated and disciplined suddenly became sporadic and panicked. Fighters who moments before had been methodically eliminating American Special Operations Forces now found themselves on the receiving end of one of the most lethal aircraft weapons systems ever devised. But Blackwood's first gun run was just the beginning. As she pulled up from her attack, dispensing flares to defeat an incoming missile, she was already planning her next approach. The Taliban had been counting on their superior numbers and prepared positions to overwhelm Neptune 6 through sheer attrition. They hadn't planned on fighting the most experienced A-10 pilot in the United States Air Force. Neptune 6, this is Viper 1-1. If you can hear me, mark your position with smoke. This time, the response was immediate. A red smoke grenade detonated in the center of the Taliban kill zone, its crimson cloud marking the exact position where 8 SEALs were fighting for their lives. The fact that they still had smoke grenades meant they were still alive. The fact that they were disciplined enough to mark their position accurately meant they were still thinking tactically. That was all Blackwood needed to know. Her second gun run came from the opposite direction, catching the Taliban positions from an angle they hadn't expected. The Avenger cannon traced a line of destruction along the eastern ridge, silencing machine gun positions that had been pouring fire down onto the trapped SEALs. Concrete fortifications that had taken months to construct were reduced to rubble in seconds. Good hits, good hits. The voice came through on the emergency frequency, weak and strained but unmistakably American. Northeast position is still active. Repeat, northeast position is still active. Chief Petty Officer Jake Reaper Morrison, Neptune 6's team leader, was still alive. Despite being pinned down for over 4 hours, despite losing 2 of his men in the initial ambush, despite facing odds that would have broken lesser warriors, Morrison was still commanding his team and calling in corrections for close air support. Blackwood banked hard right, lining up for her third attack. The northeast position Morrison had identified was partially concealed by an overhanging rock formation, protected from direct overhead attack. She would have to come in low and fast, threading the needle between the rock walls of the narrow valley. Neptune 6, Viper 1-1, stand by for northeast attack, danger close. Copy, danger close, we're keeping our heads down. The term danger close in military terminology meant that friendly forces were within the minimum safe distance of the attack. Standard procedure called for a safety margin of at least 200 meters when employing the GAU-8 cannon. Morrison's team was less than 50 meters from the target. But standard procedure had never accounted for Viper. Blackwood's approach was so low that her landing gear nearly scraped the valley floor. She could see individual Taliban fighters scrambling for cover, their weapons abandoned as they realized what was about to happen. The Avenger cannon spoke again, its depleted uranium rounds striking the northeast position with surgical precision. The sound was indescribable, part thunder, part mechanical scream, part primordial roar of destruction. Rock and steel and human flesh disappeared in clouds of dust and debris. When the dust settled, the northeast position no longer existed. "Target destroyed," Blackwood reported, pulling up sharply to avoid the debris field she'd just created. "Neptune 6, what's your status?" Morrison's voice came through clearer now, the relief evident despite his professional composure. "Viper 1-1, you just saved our lives. We have 2 KIA, 3 wounded, but we can move. Need immediate extraction." 2 killed in action. The words hit Blackwood like a physical blow, even though she'd been expecting them. 2 American warriors who would never see their families again, never share another beer with their teammates, never feel the satisfaction of a mission accomplished. Their sacrifice had bought time for the others to survive, but that knowledge didn't make the loss any easier to bear. "Roger, Neptune 6. Extraction bird is en route. I'll maintain overwatch until your wheel's up." What followed was a masterclass in close air support doctrine. For the next 47 minutes, as a rescue helicopter fought its way through Taliban air defenses to reach the surrounded SEALs, Blackwood circled overhead like a guardian angel armed with depleted uranium teeth. Every time enemy fighters attempted to regroup and continue their attack, the GAU-8 cannon reminded them why that was a fatal mistake. She made 11 attack runs in total, expending nearly all of her ammunition and pushing her aircraft to the limits of its performance envelope. By the time the Black Hawk touched down in the valley to extract Neptune 6, the Taliban force that had seemed so overwhelming just hours before had been effectively neutralized. "Viper 1-1, Chaos Main. Outstanding work, return to base." But Blackwood didn't leave immediately. She remained on station, circling high above the extraction site, until the Black Hawk carrying Neptune 6's survivors had cleared the mountains and reached friendly airspace. Only then did she turn her battered A-10 toward home, her fuel gauge reading dangerously low and her ammunition counters showing empty. The flight back to Bagram gave her time to think about what had just happened. Somewhere in the bureaucratic maze of after-action reports and casualty notifications, the human cost of the morning's mission would be reduced to statistics and lessons learned. But for Blackwood, the memory of Morrison's voice calling, "Man down," over the radio would stay with her forever. That was the burden every close air support pilot carried, not just the technical challenge of putting ordnance on target, but the emotional weight of the warriors who depended on their skills for survival. Every successful mission was measured not just in enemies killed or objectives secured, but in American lives saved. As Bagram Airfield came into view, Blackwood could see emergency vehicles positioned along the runway. Her aircraft had taken multiple hits during the mission, though none had penetrated the cockpit's titanium armor. Fuel was streaming from minor punctures in her wing tanks, and several warning lights were flashing on her instrument panel. But she was alive, her aircraft was flyable, and 6 SEALs were on their way home. In the world of combat aviation, that constituted an unqualified success. The landing was uneventful, though Blackwood could feel the aircraft pulling slightly to the left, probably damage to the landing gear or flight controls from ground fire. As she taxied to the parking ramp, she could see dozens of maintenance personnel and officers waiting for her. Word of the rescue mission had already spread throughout the base. Technical Sergeant Santos was the first to reach her aircraft as the engines wound down. The crew chief's typically stoic expression had been replaced by something approaching awe as she conducted her post-flight inspection. "Ma'am, I count 14 bullet holes in the fuselage and at least 6 in the wings. How the hell are you still flying?" Blackwood climbed down from her cockpit, her legs unsteady after nearly 3 hours of high-G maneuvering and adrenaline saturation. Because someone built this aircraft right, and someone else maintains it right. It was a typical Viper response, deflecting credit while acknowledging the team effort that made every mission possible. But Santos had worked on A-10s for 15 years, and she knew the difference between good flying and great flying. What Captain Blackwood had accomplished that morning fell into an entirely different category. Colonel Mitchell was waiting in the squadron debriefing room when Blackwood arrived, still wearing her sweat-stained flight suit and carrying her helmet bag. The colonel's reputation for brevity was legendary, but when he spoke, his words carried the weight of genuine appreciation. "Captain, I've been in this business for 25 years. What you did out there was the finest display of close air support I've ever witnessed." "Thank you, sir, just doing my job." "No," Mitchell said firmly. "Your job was to provide close air support. What you did was save 6 American lives at considerable risk to your own. There's a difference, and every person on this base knows it." The debriefing lasted 2 hours, with intelligence officers meticulously documenting every aspect of the mission. Target coordinates, weapons expenditure, battle damage assessment, enemy tactics and capabilities. All of it would be analyzed, cataloged, and distributed throughout the military intelligence community. Future missions would benefit from the lessons learned in that Afghan valley. But the most important lesson couldn't be captured in an intelligence report or tactical manual. It was something intangible, something that existed in the hearts and minds of the warriors who'd been there. The knowledge that when everything went wrong, when the odds were impossible, when even the SEALs needed saving, there was someone willing to risk everything to bring them home. By evening, word of Viper's rescue mission had reached every corner of Bagram Airfield. Stories spread through the dining facilities and flight lines, growing more dramatic with each telling. Some focused on the technical aspects: 11-gun runs in a single mission, danger-close fire support, solo penetration of defended airspace. Others emphasized the human element: 2 SEALs killed, 6 lives saved, a pilot who refused to abandon fellow Americans. All of them were true, but none captured the complete picture. The complete picture was Chief Petty Officer Morrison sitting in the base hospital, his left arm in a sling and his face bandaged from shrapnel wounds, insisting on calling Blackwood personally to thank her. It was the maintenance crew working through the night to repair her battle-damaged aircraft, taking pride in the knowledge that their work had made the rescue possible. It was the intelligence analysts poring over satellite imagery, trying to understand how the Taliban had managed to set such an effective ambush. Most of all, it was the quiet professionalism with which Blackwood had conducted herself throughout the entire ordeal. No grandstanding, no heroic speeches, no dramatic gestures. Just a pilot doing her job with exceptional skill and unwavering determination. That night, as she lay in her narrow bunk in the female officer quarters, Blackwood stared at the ceiling and thought about the 2 SEALs who hadn't made it home. Petty Officer First Class David Chen and Petty Officer Second Class Michael Rodriguez, both posthumously promoted, both awarded the Silver Star, both gone forever. Their deaths weighed on her as they should have. In the brutal arithmetic of combat, saving 6 lives while losing 2 might be considered a victory, but it never felt like one to the people who had to live with the aftermath. Tomorrow there would be more missions, more targets, more opportunities to prove that the A-10 Thunderbolt II remained the world's premier close air support aircraft. There would be medals and commendations, formal recognition of her actions in that valley. There would be interviews with military journalists and case studies for the Air Force Academy. But tonight, there was only the weight of responsibility and the knowledge that somewhere in that valley, 2 American warriors had made the ultimate sacrifice for their brothers in arms. Their names would be added to the memorial wall at Dam Neck. Their stories would be told in SEAL team-ready rooms for generations to come, and their families would receive folded flags and the grateful thanks of a nation. And Captain Zara, Viper, Blackwood would carry their memory with her for the rest of her life, along with the memories of all the others she'd been unable to save over the years. It was part of the job, part of the burden that came with the privilege of flying close air support missions for America's finest warriors. But it was also part of what made moments like this morning so important. 6 SEALs were alive because she'd been willing to risk everything to bring them home. 6 families wouldn't receive that devastating knock on the door. 6 warriors would live to fight another day, to see their children grow up, to share stories and laughter with their teammates. In the grand scheme of a war that had been raging for over a decade, one rescue mission might seem insignificant. But for the people involved, the pilots, the SEALs, the families waiting at home, it represented everything that mattered about military service. The commitment to leave no one behind, the willingness to sacrifice for others, the understanding that freedom isn't free and sometimes must be paid for with blood and courage. As sleep finally claimed her, Blackwood's last conscious thought was of her aircraft sitting on the flight line, battered but not broken, ready to fly again when duty called. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new missions, new opportunities to prove that some things were worth fighting for. But that was tomorrow. Tonight, 6 American warriors were alive because someone had been willing to risk everything to bring them home. And in the end, that was what mattered most. The awards ceremony took place 3 weeks later, on a surprisingly cool morning for Afghanistan in July. The entire base seemed to have turned out for the event, from senior officers to enlisted maintenance crews. Even some of the surviving members of Neptune 6 had been flown in from their various recovery locations to witness the presentation. Blackwood stood at attention in her dress blue uniform, the same uniform she'd worn to dozens of similar ceremonies over the years. But this time was different. This time, she wasn't watching from the audience as other people received recognition for their service. This time, she was the center of attention, and she found the experience deeply uncomfortable. Colonel Mitchell's voice carried clearly across the assembled formation as he read from the citation. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against an enemy of the United States, while serving as an A-10C pilot, Captain Blackwood's extraordinary heroism and selfless devotion to duty resulted in the successful rescue of 6 American Special Operations personnel and reflect great credit upon herself, the United States Air Force, and the Department of Defense. The Distinguished Flying Cross was heavy in her hands as she accepted it, heavier than its actual physical weight would suggest. Not because of the medal and ribbon, but because of what it represented: the sacrifice of the 2 SEALs who hadn't come home, the trust of the 6 who had, and the expectations of everyone who would look to her as an example in the future. Chief Morrison approached after the ceremony, walking with a slight limp but otherwise looking remarkably good for someone who'd spent 4 hours in a Taliban kill zone. His handshake was firm, his eyes clear and steady. "Ma'am, I've got 6 kids who'll never have to grow up without their dads because of what you did. I can't ever repay that, but I want you to know it means everything. Chief, you don't owe me anything. You and your team did the hard part. I just provided taxi service." Morrison smiled at that, the kind of smile that only came from shared experience under fire. "If that was taxi service, ma'am, I'd like to know where you learned to drive." The conversation was interrupted by the approach of a young airman first class, barely old enough to shave, who snapped to attention and saluted with textbook precision. "Ma'am, I'm Airman Rodriguez. I wanted to thank you for what you did. One of those SEALs, Petty Officer Rodriguez. He was my cousin." The family connection hit Blackwood harder than any enemy fire she'd ever faced. This wasn't just about military objectives or tactical success. It was about real people with real families, young men who'd grown up together, played together, dreamed together. And now one of them was coming home in a flag-draped coffin, while the other stood before her with tears in his eyes. "Your cousin was a hero, Airman. He died fighting to save his teammates. There's no higher honor for a warrior." "Yes, ma'am, but I want you to know, his death wasn't meaningless. Because you were there, because you cared enough to risk everything, 6 other families get to keep their sons and fathers and brothers. Miguel would have wanted it that way." After the ceremony, after the handshakes and congratulations and formal photographs, Blackwood found herself alone on the flight line, standing beside her aircraft. Technical Sergeant Santos had been working overtime to repair the battle damage, and the looked almost as good as new. Almost. If you knew where to look, you could still see the subtle signs: slightly different paint where panels had been replaced, small dents where fragments had struck but not penetrated. Battle scars, Santos called them, proof that the aircraft had done its job and lived to tell about it. "She's ready to fly again, ma'am," the crew chief reported, approaching with a clipboard full of maintenance forms. "All systems check out, weapons are loaded, fuel is topped off. Where are we going tomorrow?" "Wherever they need us, Sergeant, same as always." It was a simple answer, but it captured the essence of what military service meant to both of them. Not glory or recognition or medals, but the quiet satisfaction of being ready to answer the call when duty demanded. The knowledge that somewhere out there, American warriors were counting on their skills and dedication to bring them home safely. The war in Afghanistan would continue for several more years, with its endless cycle of missions and casualties, victories and defeats. There would be other rescue operations, other displays of courage and sacrifice, other heroes whose names would be remembered in military history. But for those who were there that day in July, watching Captain Zara Blackwood receive the Distinguished Flying Cross for her actions in rescuing Neptune 6, the memory would never fade. They had witnessed something extraordinary, not just the technical proficiency of a skilled pilot, but the moral courage of someone who refused to accept that any American warrior was beyond saving. In a conflict often characterized by ambiguity and frustration, where victory was measured in increments and success was temporary, Blackwood's mission represented something clear and unambiguous: the absolute commitment to leave no one behind. Years later, when they told their own children about their service in Afghanistan, they would remember that morning differently than all the others. They would remember the sound of the A-10's engine screaming over the ridge, the sight of depleted uranium rounds chewing through enemy positions, and the voice on the radio that refused to give up even when the situation seemed hopeless. Most of all, they would remember the woman who proved that heroism wasn't about gender or politics or breaking barriers. It was about being willing to risk everything for the people who counted on you to bring them home. That was Viper's legacy, and it would endure long after the last American forces left Afghanistan, long after the medals tarnished and the citations were filed away in dusty archives. In the hearts and minds of the warriors who served with her, the story would live on, passed down from generation to generation of military aviators. A reminder that sometimes one person really could make all the difference in the world. And somewhere in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan, in a valley where 8 Americans once fought for their lives against impossible odds, the wind still carries echoes of that distinctive sound: the roar of an A-10 Thunderbolt II, flown by a pilot who refused to let her warriors die alone.